I would like to tell you a little bit about some studies that we're doing on the biological basis of autism here at the M.I.N.D Institute. And there's an enormous amount of research going on autism at the M.I.N.D Institute. I can't even begin to summarize all that's going on in the short period of time that we have available. We have studies on the genes related to autism. We have studies on the relationship of the immune system to autism. We have imaging studies, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about today. We have sophisticated behavioral studies, studies that are looking at the earliest signs of autism behaviorally, as well as looking for biomarkers. So there's lots and lots of stuff going on at the M.I.N.D Institute, and I'm only going to be able to tell you a little bit about it. But I want to actually tell you about a study that addresses the issue that autism is incredibly complex. It's incredibly heterogeneous. Now, all of you who are familiar with autism know that there are three common characteristics in all individuals that have autism. These three: the social impairments, communication impairments, and repetitive behaviors. But beyond that, we see a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in the severity of individuals' autism, as well as what we call comorbid symptoms, things like epilepsy. So 30% of people with autism have epilepsy, but 70% don't. A large number of individuals with autism have gastrointestinal problems, but again, many, many people don't. And the question is why? And the way we think about autism now is that it's not a single disease. It's actually, when we get enough information about autism, what we think we'll know is that there are going to be various types of autism: autism type A, type B, type C. And when you ask what causes autism, there's actually going to be different causes or different combinations of causes for each one of these types of autism. And so I think the field now believes that there are certainly going to be genetic contributions to autism. 30 years ago, we didn't know a single gene that was linked to autism. Now we know probably 30 different genes that are risk factors for autism. If you have a mutation on those genes, you would be slightly more likely to have autism. But the confusing thing is that any one gene that we found is not associated with anything more than a couple of % of kids with autism. And in fact, it gets even more confusing because that gene can be mutated in a child with autism, but you can have that same mutation in an individual who has either developmental delays or maybe perfectly normal. So it's not the case, it doesn't seem like, that there's going to be an autism gene or even a small number of autism genes that absolutely cause autism. But there are risk genes, and we're trying to figure that out. The other thing that we now know is that probably autism is going to be like a lot of modern diseases, like heart disease. There has to be something else that goes on in the environment to actually lead these genetic risk factors to cause the disorder. So if you think about it in terms of heart disease, you might have a gene that predisposes you to hypertension or to high cholesterol levels. But if you exercise, you watch your diet, you keep your blood pressure low, you may never have heart disease. However, in contrast, if you eat a fatty diet, you don't get any exercise, it's more likely that you're going to have heart disease. And so that's what's called a gene by environment interaction. And so we think that a lot of autism might be a genetic predisposition, but something else has to happen in the environment to really cause the autism. We're trying to figure out. We have a huge program of research here at the M.I.N.D Institute led by Erva Hertz-Pachotto, an epidemiologist, trying to figure out what factors it is in the environment that might be trigger factors. And, you know, there's a lot of them, and she's, you know, we've just begun to scratch the surface. And finally, we actually think that there may be some forms of autism where you don't have to have a genetic predisposition, but you can experience something in the environment which will cause autism. And the reason the data for this came from early studies where we knew that women that were exposed to rubella during pregnancy or to a drug called thalidomide. Thalidomide was used in the 1950s and 60s as an anti-nausea medication during pregnancy. And it turned out that it caused horrific birth defects. But as it turns out, that if you took thalidomide at a certain time during your pregnancy, actually at the end of your first trimester, not only did you have a child that had birth defects, but there was a higher percentage of those children that went on to have autism. And the presumption there is that had they not been exposed in utero to the thalidomide, they wouldn't have had autism, right? So we're working on the premise that there's lots of types of autism, and there's probably going to be lots of different causes to autism. So the question is, given this heterogeneity, how do you study autism? How do you try and figure out what is a particular cause? And we realized, all of our colleagues here at the M.I.N.D Institute years ago, that trying to deal with all autism at the same time is going to be really not the best strategy for making progress. So what we've done, we launched a study called the Autism Phenome Project. Basically what it means is that we wanted to get enough information about a large enough population of children with autism to say, okay, here's the autism type A kids, here's the autism type B kids, and here's the autism type C kids. And when we started this study, we didn't know what factors would allow us to divide the group into these more homogeneous subsets. The way this study takes place is, we've been doing this since 2006. Children come into the study when they're somewhere between 2 and 3.5 years of age. We actually welcome all children into this study because we actually want to look at all different types. We have very few exclusions. One of the interesting things about this study is that we're studying girls as well. Most studies in autism, because there's 4 times as many boys as girls who have autism, most studies work only with boys because it's easier to get a bunch of boys to do the science. But we are interested in understanding what's the differences in autism in girls and boys. And at the same time, we're also looking at age-matched, typically developing children to see how a child with autism deviates from the development of a typically developing child. Where do changes take place as the child matures? I won't go into all of this, but this is a very extensive study. We get behavioral data, we get medical information, we do a magnetic resonance image of the brain, and we also get some measures of how the brain is functioning using what's called EEG, or electroencephalogram. We even take images of the child's face to look for what's called dysmorphic features. If there's some irregularities in the way the face is, that actually sometimes indicates that there's a genetic underlying syndrome. Where we're at the moment, we have 330 children in the study. What you can see is that the average age when the children come in is about 3 years of age. We have about 4 times as many boys as girls, but we're trying to look at the population. And the other thing that we're trying to do is make this representative. So we've tried to be as inclusive as possible, considering race and ethnicity. And I just wanted to show you one feature of this in my time, and that is what we're finding about differences in how the brain is organized in autism. So if you looked at something like Alzheimer's disease, what you'd find is that there's a pathology there. This is actually something you can see under the microscope. There are lesions in the brain. And it's pretty much the same lesions in any brain that you look at that has Alzheimer's disease. We've done a lot of research on that, and we know that. But we don't actually know at this point what is the pathology, what's different in the brain of an individual with autism, or whether there are different pathologies in different kids with autism in these different subtypes. So we actually have imaged all of the children in the Autism Phenome Project. This actually shows some excuse me, MRIs. And what you can see, there's a little guy's nose here, and this is like going through the middle of his head, and you can see the different parts of the brain here. Not only do we look at the size and shape of different parts of the brain, but these colored things down here actually allow us to look at connectivity from one part of the brain to the other, and using a very sophisticated technique. So how do you get a little kid to stay still in the MRI? Well, it turns out it wouldn't work if you asked them to come in, because they have to, if you've had an MRI, you know you have to stay still. We actually do 30 minutes of imaging with these little kids. But again, they're 2 to 3.5 years old. So what we do is we work with the families, And this is actually not the real scanner, but it's a mock scanner, so the child can come in and play on the scanner, get sort of used to it, so they're not frightened about the scanner. The MRIs are really loud, so we actually have to send ear protection home with the children. But for 2 weeks before the child comes to the MRI, the parents actually play this scanner sounds on their boombox, you know, bah, 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 every night when the child goes to sleep. And then by 2 weeks later, either the child is not going to make it, or they don't care any longer. So what happens when the child comes in? Here's what a real MRI looks like. But we have some children that will come in asleep. You know, the parents will bring them in and out of the car seat, and we'll bring them in asleep. But other children will come in awake. And what we do is we convert the MRI suite by putting up all of this material and stuff, so it basically looks like a queen bed. And so the parents can, the mom and dad can come in, they can actually read to the child, they can sing songs, they can watch a video even. The child will go to sleep, and then the child is sort of lifted up into the head coil, zoomed into the tube, and we can do 30 minutes of imaging. And the amazing thing is this is our stats so far. Out of the 300 or so families that are involved, we have 235 children that we've been successful at getting these MRIs, which is over 90% success. And it's a testimony to where you have a partnership between the families who have to work with us and the scientists, you know, to get the child ready, to get the child feeling comfortable. And then it works extremely well. So what do we get? Well, it turns out that one of the common findings that you'll read about the brain in autism is that the brain's too big, that it actually grows too fast, too early. And we've actually replicated that. But interestingly, we've only replicated it in boys. Now, the number of girls that we have is still sort of small, but whereas in boys, if you look at the total brain and you measure how big it is, it's 6% bigger in the boys with autism than in the controls. In the girls, we don't see any difference. That would be a very striking difference between the sexes if it holds up. But the other thing that we find is that this is just a plot of the child's age and then how big its brain is. And the blue dots are typically developing kids, and the red dots are kids with autism. And what you see is that the blue dots are sort of tightly close together, but the red dots are everywhere. The kids with autism, their brains are highly variable in terms of the total size. And when we started looking at this, we realized that maybe this correlates with some other feature of their autism. And I can't go into much detail here, but basically our friends in the behavior team can go back and look at some of the questionnaires that our parents fill out and determine whether a child is what we call either early onset or regressive. And the basic definition is that early onset is by 12 months of age, you already see that there's something different about that child. You see some of the signs and symptoms of autism, even at 12 months of age. Whereas in regression at 12 months of age, the child looks pretty normal. And then between 18 and 24 months, they lose language, they lose social ability, they regress back into autism. So we've been able to say, is there any difference between the children that have early onset versus regressive autism? And it turns out, yes, there is. So this plot shows the size of children with autism, the brains of children with autism here, and here's the controls. And what you can see is that the kids that have early onset autism, their brain size is no different from the controls. It's actually the kids who have regressive autism that have the bigger brain. Okay? So this is the first strong indication from our study that now we can at least divide these kids up into two meaningful subsets. A group of kids who have regressive autism, and if you look at their brain, they're the ones there whose brain is actually growing too rapidly. Whereas the kids who have early onset, their brains actually look just like typically developing kids. And it turns out, I won't show you the data just so I can move on, but this part of the brain, this is just a picture of all the different lobes of the brain. And it turns out when we analyze this even in more detail, it's this part of the brain, the frontal lobe, that's really driving this. And what does the frontal lobe do? It's the part of the brain that we think is involved in social behavior, executive function, planning for the future, a lot of the kinds of things that make us most human, and a lot of the things that are impaired in autism. So we're very excited about this finding. And then because we had the medical records for these children, we could actually go back and say, well, how about head circumference? If you just simply look at the head circumference that is measured every time you go for a well baby checkup, and it turns out we have data that goes all the way back to the birth head circumference. So this is just taking a tape measure and going around the head. It turns out what you see here, it's a little hard to see, but the blue again is the typically developing children, the size of their head. And the lighter blue, or whatever that color is, are the kids who have early onset autism, and they really don't differ at all from the typically developing kids. But the kids who have the regressive form of autism, their head circumference starts getting bigger even at 4 months of age. So that there's something that's taking place that probably presages the data we see in our MRIs that's done when the kids are 2 to 3 years of age, already taking place at 4 to 6 months of age. So this would suggest that there's a different biology taking place in the kids with the early onset versus the regressive autism. What that is exactly, we don't know. But interestingly, again, with these kids, we have samples of their blood. And we're just getting prepared to look at the genetics. And now we can ask the question, a smart question, what's the difference in terms of genes of the kids who have the early onset form of autism, whose brain doesn't change or isn't different, from the kids who have the regressive form, who have this precocious growth of their frontal lobe. And we would expect to see a clearer picture of genetic differences in those two groups. So that's all I'm going to show you. I just want to highlight this because I think we're just really this is the tip of the iceberg. We have data on, again, over 300 families. We're looking at characteristics of the mother's blood, of the mother's genes, of the father's genes, the father's blood, how that might predict something that's going on in the children. This is data that we'll be analyzing for the next decade, I don't know, but a long time. And again, I just want to point out that this is a study that probably couldn't be done any place other than the M.I.N.D Institute, because we have an incredible team of people who are able not only to do the MRI, but the behavioral assessments, the immunology, and the genetics, everything else that I've talked about. And it's a good example of where you're going to see over the next several years that more and more there are going to be biological differences that differentiate different subsets of kids with autism. And why does this make any difference? Because if you know the biology of a particular subset of kids with autism, hopefully that will lead to better interventions, either better prevention or better interventions of that child. It's what we call personal medicine, or personalized medicine. Now we just try everything on every child, but oftentimes it doesn't work. This, we hope, will tell us why something works in a particular child and not in others. So with that, I want to now go on to a different form of intervention, which our resident expert, Sally Rogers, is one of the world's experts on behavioral therapies.
I'm going to tell you just a little bit about 3 different treatment studies that we're running right now. The ACE, the infant treatment study, and then a technology study that Lori's doing, just to give you a little highlight about what we're doing. And let me start with the early steps study. This is a large multi-site study that's going on in 3 different states. It's going on in here, M.I.N.D Institute, UC Davis. It's going on at the University of Washington in Seattle. It's going on in the University of Michigan. Kathy Lord is directing the study there, and Annette Estes is directing the study in Seattle. And then we have a whole 4th team, and all they're doing is gathering the data and analyzing for us, and they're at the University of Washington too. So we have a lot of people working on this study. And the idea in this study and in all of the intervention studies that we do is that while David's been talking with you about the biology of autism, and we assume that there is a biology to autism, the way that kids are coming up in different houses and different kinds of families, different peer groups, different siblings, that seems to have a lot to do with their development too. And so this is the way that I think about autism, that there's this biological difference, like David was talking about, that is born, that's in the genes of children with autism, and it affects their brain, how their brain grows, just like David was just talking about, and how that brain works. And that there are differences in the way that the brain develops, and there are probably differences in the way that brain works. And those differences are going to affect a child's development, affect their learning, affect their language. However, babies come into the world as part of a social environment, and the way that people interact with children has a big effect on their brain development too. From the beginning of life, families who talk more to babies have babies who talk more and process more language. Children who are deprived of certain kinds of like hearing because they're deaf, it affects their brain development and the whole area of that brain. So the experiences that babies have starting at day one actually changes their brains. It affects their brains. Experience grows a brain. It even affects the genetics that are being expressed in that child from day to day. And so we've got not just the biology of a brain that's sculpting the brain and helping it figure out how to work and how to send those impulses and how to learn, but we also have the daily experiences of a child that are also sculpting that brain and helping it learn more, learn faster, become a more efficient learning tool. And so these things are all working together to influence how quickly that child is developing, how many symptoms they have. And then, as you all know, anybody who's been exposed to a child with autism, the kinds of symptoms that a child has really affects their social environment. It changes a family, it changes a sibling, whether your child with autism is highly aggressive and pushing everybody away, or whether your child is talking to you or not talking. The symptoms a child has affects and changes their environment. And those environmental effects then play back and affect the biology, the underlying biology of autism. So it's not like this is something that happened at birth. I think of autism as something that's happening every single day. Every day that child is alive, what's happening is affecting that child's brain development and their learning, for positive or for negative. So the idea with intervention is that we can impact here and make the social environment as rich a learning experience as possible, and then feed those learning experiences into the child's developing brain and their symptoms, and have the kinds of changes then feed back to reinforce their family, help family life go better, encourage more school experiences, etc. It's like a living thing. It's like cooking. Every piece that you put in affects the outcome. There's no one single direction. So this is what our early interventions are about, affecting brain development this way, not through medicine, but through ongoing day-by-day opportunities for babies to sculpt their brains through their experiences. And we study a specific kind of interventions called the Early Start Denver model that I've been working on since I was a young woman with babies instead of grown-ups. And the key features of the Early Start Denver model are, first of all, that it's an approach that's based on the qualities of relationship and development that we know are also true in human development. There is a framework of behavior teaching. Applied behavior analysis is the science of learning. But there is also quite a bit to learning involving how relationships occur with each other, the developmental steps that children go through. And one of the things we've learned more and more about over the last 20 years is that little children with autism follow the same developmental paths as little children without autism. And the ways that parents talk to little children with autism affect their language development just like the ways parents talk with children without autism affects their language development. So there's a lot we can take from typical development and typical experience and build learning environments for children with autism. And that's what we've been trying to do. See how we can take those typical experiences of play and play with other people and having a great time on the living room floor with your mom and dad, and how we can really create really powerful intervention effects from those. Now, we studied this and published a paper last year. My colleague Jerry Dawson was the first author of this, and this was the first time we'd really tested this approach in what's called a randomized trial. And that's like, you know, where half the kids by chance get assigned to one treatment and half the kids get assigned to like the placebo. This would be how you test a new drug. Well, we did this in Seattle, and half the children got randomly assigned to this particular intervention. And we carried it out. We studied 48 children, half getting Early Start Denver model, which I'll call ESDM, and half not. And they got 2 years of intervention. We delivered 20 hours a week in their homes, one-on-one play intervention in their household with their own toys. And we also taught their parents how to do it and met with the parents every week for 2 solid years. What we ended up finding was, first of all, there was a very strong effect on IQ. That after 2 years, even though the 2 groups of children, the ones in ESDM like are here, and the children who were in the community started out the same place with an IQ of about 60. Within 2 years, the children who were getting ESDM gained almost 20 IQ points, almost 70, almost to 80. And the children getting community intervention gained a few IQ points to about 68. So this is a really big difference. And it's not because the ESDM kids were getting more hours. The kids were getting the same number of hours. The kids who were in the community were getting preschool and speech therapy and OT. So this is really showing that the approach itself makes a difference. We found this not only for IQ, but we also found it for language. We found it for adaptive behavior. We found it for the symptoms, whether the kids continued to have full autism or whether they evolved more mild symptoms over time. So we found this had effects in a lot of different areas. And what we found was that, I mean, some kids are making as many as 30-point gains. A third of our sample made 30-point IQ gains. So that was the first study. And you know, you never can, a piece of science, once you show something the first time, that's not proof of a fact. You know, you've got to be able to show it a couple of times. Anybody remember cold fusion? One finding does not equal science, it just equals one finding. But if 2 or 3 scientists find the same thing in different cities across the world with different groups of people, then it starts to be a fact and not just a finding. So we have to redo what we did before and see whether we can create the same findings again. And that's what I'm doing now. That's the study I'm telling you about. This is now going on in 3 cities with 100 children, all 1-year-olds. And we're doing the same kind of randomized controlled trial. Half the kids are getting this treatment, half the kids are getting their community treatments. And we're about halfway through this study. And I wish I had the data to share with you, and I don't because we're only halfway through the study. But what I can tell you is that we have enrolled, where am I? We found 117 1-year-olds across these 3 cities that qualify. 97 of the families were willing to join our study. And so far, we have 21 children have completed it, and we have about 75 left to go. So we're in the middle of doing this study right now. We have a nice range of families. I said all the children are 1-year-olds. A third of the families are of other ethnic groups than Caucasian. It's a kind of a middle income group of family with slightly higher than average education. There are almost no differences in the groups in the children that are inside in our treatment versus the other. So they're very well balanced in terms of IQs and severity of symptoms and things like that. So we start out by teaching the families how to do the intervention. This is a not so complex intervention. Families learn to do it quickly, and here you see 50 families. And week by week, how they're learning the techniques. So all we do the first 12 weeks is teach the family how to do it. And here you see that the family start, a 3 is a kind of average use of the techniques we're going to teach them. So some of the families start out already kind of knowing how to do this kind of play. But what you see is that very quickly, within 6 weeks of 1 hour a week, work with their therapist, you see the family's getting really very good at this. This is the smoothed out version that shows you that families are reaching the same level of skill as the therapist by about 6 to 8 sessions. So this is something families get, and they move it into their homes, and the whole idea is that families learn how to use this when they're diapering, when they're feeding, when they're playing on the floor, when they're bathing, so they can create lots and lots of learning opportunities with their children in a day-by-day basis. So far, we have delivered 31,325 hours of treatment to the children in this study. And we have another 1.5 years or so to go. So we have a large team of very talented young people who are out there driving all over Michigan, Sacramento area and Seattle with their bags of toys, playing with children for a lot of time during the day. So a couple of things that started to emerge, and one of the things that we just found out last week, which I think is really, really important, is that we've so far been able to look at the first 12 weeks that the children are enrolled and start to look at the changes that they're making in the first 12 weeks, which is when their parents are learning the techniques. And one of the really critical things we are learning is that the number of hours of treatment they're getting, even as 1-year-olds, right after diagnosis, has a powerful effect on their IQ and their language changes right from the beginning. So here's the effect on changes in IQ is extremely significant just in 12 weeks. And we're only talking about a difference of like 2 to 6 or 7 hours a week. We're not talking about 40 hours a week. We're talking about small increments of treatment. But in these 1-year-olds, it makes a big difference. It makes a difference in their IQs, and it makes a difference in the severity of autism. And it's there right from the beginning. So up until this point, nobody's been able to answer the questions. Where's the proof that the number of hours children are getting has an effect on their IQ or on their outcomes? And there's data from a group of 1-year-olds that shows very rapidly you start to see effects on the children's development. Here we also are seeing effects on the parent's sense of competence. Within 12 weeks, the families who are getting this particular intervention are showing a much higher sense of competence and self-assurance and confidence in themselves than children who've been diagnosed and then are trying to find other kinds of community services in the first 12 weeks. So helping families learn, some people worry about, parents shouldn't have to be therapists, and right after diagnosis it's really a hard time for families. Amen, it is. But families have too much to deal with. Don't expect them to learn a big complicated intervention. Well, when you know how to do something, you feel like you're doing something that's helping your child, it makes you feel better, not worse. And there's never a time that families are more motivated to help their children than right after you find out your child has a problem. You want to help. Well, I want to just show you a little bit about what the outcomes of this intervention look like.
Meaning like when John's just trying to get him to help pay the doll.
More. There you go.
Maybe we can try a new activity and see if he'll talk to you for a few minutes. Something else.
So one of the things I want you to notice is that it's really hard to figure out what he wants. Even when we give him the things he's asking for, it doesn't make him happier.
Okay, so today's topic
You want more? More. Okay, there's some more. You don't want me to. That's it. Are you on this? Okay, so as you see, he doesn't have any words. He doesn't have much of a way of communicating what he wants very clearly. I asked the dad during this hour, so how often do you experience this? Is this like every week you see a tantrum like this, every day? And the dad says every hour, every quarter hour. This was going on all the time. This is a very, very upset child for whom there no way of communicating or helping him soothe had been found. These are experienced family. They've got 2 other children at this point, developing very well. This is a very difficult little boy. Okay, so let me show you a year later.
Oh! Happy, the smile you see upon my face as the sun shines in the sky shows the world that I feel happy and my mood is soaring high. Look, I see something that's red and yellow and it smells good.
The flowers.
The flowers, yeah, that's it. I see something big and yellow and it's hot.
The sun.
The sun, yeah. Sometimes I feel so very sad and really don't know why. Instead of playing and having fun, I cry and cry and cry. Oh, thanks, big guy. Can you show me a sad face? What does it look like when you're sad?
He's doing okay. He's okay.
He'll be okay. Can you show me what you look like when you're sad? Show me sad. It's okay, Coulson.
It's okay.
Yeah, you'll be just fine. We're not really sad. We're just pretending, huh? I see something green and leafy.
The tree.
The tree, yeah.
He feels angry.
Angry is how I feel right now. I shout with a mighty roar. I mostly want to frown and growl and stomp upon the floor. Show me your frown and your growl. Roar! And stomp on the floor. That's mad. We lost our page. Oh no. I think we are
Okay. And now I'm going to show you 2 years, right, as he was finishing. This is with a friend.
These are my speakers. I got some of this. I got several things. I got some.
These guys are playing, going on a picnic.
I got some. I got like half a roll of Ow!
This is a... So, 4-year-old boys, right?
Lock. You can't hit me. You can't hit me. You can't hit me down.
Hey, what happened to this picnic, guys? We're having a nice, calm, peaceful picnic.
Okay, so just to give you closure, he's now 4.5. He's in a typical preschool. All of his skills are in the normal range. He's doing very well. He is symptom-free and is getting no services and doesn't need any services. And he's the first of the, I think we've had 8 children who finished, and he is not atypical of the children who have left. As a matter of fact, he is typical. I would say 6 of the 8 children are more like him than like anybody else. So this is what is possible to accomplish when you can start really as soon as autism is beginning and provide lots and lots of learning opportunities, an environment that really focuses on play, language, and typical social emotional relatedness. So anyway, the challenge is until there are biological answers for autism, we can work with development, and we're trying to figure out every day how to do it faster, better, cheaper, and to reach more children and families. So please, if you know children and families who are looking for services in the 1 to 3 year range, know that you can refer them here. Thank you very much.
What I'm going to talk to you today is about, we have a lot of preschool intervention studies and developmental studies, a lot of studies going on. We're beginning to think, well, we need to have the developmental studies for school-age children, because in point of fact, we don't know much about the development of autism in school-age children. When you really look at the literature, the developmental studies end at around 6, and there's a few up to 9, but there's very, very few between 9 and 18. Now, there's a chance that if we study development in that period of time, we'll learn something that will help us engage in better intervention during the school-age period. So that's basically the goal of this thing called the Social Attention Virtual Reality Laboratory, and a lot of people are participating, some of whom are here right now. You know, one of the things that we really want to understand, now, there's been a sea change in autism. When Sally and David and I all began, we thought there were many, many fewer children who were achieving typical IQ when they got into school. Many fewer. We thought it was about 25% of children. But the most recent data is suggesting it's somewhere between 50 and 60% of children. And you can see this in a number of different places. This is information from the Centers for Disease Control. We now have a surveillance system where we look at the changing numbers and profiles of groups of 8-year-old children every year, every 2 years. And here we can see that, you know, in this particular cohort, it was 307,000 children. And this is where that 1 in 110 number comes from that all of us are quite familiar with. But we're not quite so familiar with this number. 59% of those children were functioning in the average range of IQ. Now that has a huge impact on schools. It enables many of those children to be in inclusive environments, and the schools are trying to catch up and figure out, okay, they're in inclusive environments, but are they learning as well? Are there some problems that are there that we need to think about? Well, it turns out that there are problems. even for high-functioning children. One thing that I hear people say, well, high-functioning children, they just need social skills work because they do fine in the classroom. But most people who work with high-functioning children in schools know that they do very well. I mean, they can be exceptionally bright and do extraordinarily well. But just like other very bright children, extraordinarily bright children, they can also have learning disabilities. And in point of fact, numbers of studies are now saying that about 70% of children, even though they have average IQs or way above average, have learning disabilities, particularly in being able to read to learn. Children with autism are pretty good at decoding words, but putting it all together to read from learning at about the 3rd grade, they start having some difficulty with that. And like many of us, they have a lot of difficulty writing, myself included, but many of the kids really have a difficult time expressing themselves. We think that this is all part and parcel of autism. Longer discussion, we could get into why this is part and parcel of autism, but it's not surprising that reading comprehension and written expression are problematic for the kids. And just to say, Sally said one study never makes a finding. Here's another study. That first study was in the United States. This is in Australia, showing that 54% of the high-functioning kids in this particular study were underachieving academically relative to their IQ, whereas that wasn't really the case for the typical kids. So what we have now is we have a bunch of really much better off children coming out of early intervention programs, and we have no idea what the impact is going to be of these really advanced interventions. These are all kids who are getting the last wave of early intervention. It may be that early intervention will be sufficient to carry these children right through school. But since, as Sally said, our brains are continuing to develop at 6 and 8 and 18, and they're being affected by the social milieu, peer interactions, greater demands to pay attention to more people, to be able to switch attention back and forth. There's a good chance that those new challenges are going to interact with vulnerabilities for kids with autism, and unless we can identify them, we're not going to be helping them as well. But if we can identify them and get in there anticipating them, we can probably prevent them from going through another period of having problems. So that's the whole goal here. And it's an important goal because even the high-functioning kids, this is a different cohort. So these are kids that were identified 25, 30 years ago. So they're getting a whole different experience. But among those cohorts of kids, even the high-functioning people aren't doing as well as we would hope for in terms of going out and having independent lives. So again, when we look at what's happening in schools, there's not a lot of research that really gets at the academic problems, a little bit more on the social, but remember Sally mentioned that randomized control trial? It's a really important type of trial to say that there's evidence for an intervention. There's relatively few of those randomized control trials with school-age children. In fact, in this particular review in 2008, 45 studies were done, but only 118 children in the studies. And that's not what you have in a randomized control trial. You should, for 45 studies, you should have at least 200 children or 300 children if they were all going to be adequate studies. Okay. So what we're trying to do, Sally mentioned that part of her intervention goes after sort of core problems. You know, in the 70s, we had no idea what the core social disturbance was in autism, none whatsoever. A woman named Pat Howland wrote a chapter in 1976 where she described the entirety of the research on the social behavior of children with autism, and there were only 6 empirical papers cited in that chapter. Between 76 and 1990, we had just an explosion of information on infant development and infant social development, and that translated into really important developmental research, sort of a well in which people who were doing early intervention could go and look and find clues to how to intervene with children with autism. A developmental literature is pretty important if you're going to intervene with a developmental disorder. It's hard not to have it. So one of the things that came out of that literature was social attention, and Sally had it in sort of the targets for her intervention model. And we can talk about social attention as most of us have, if we have an option between looking at people and looking at objects, many of us will look at people, if not most of us. That preference might not be so strong in children with autism. Many of us, when we look at faces, can pretty much automatically and rapidly process the affect or the identity or the gender of the face. That processing is not so facile in kids with autism. They don't do it so well. Not an absolute, but they don't do it so well. And then joint attention. Right now, when I go like this and look over here, you all look over there. You follow my gaze. It almost compels you to do so. It's not so strong with kids with autism. So all three of these social areas are vulnerable. They're kind of weak. And if you don't have these, it's really hard to learn because you got to pay attention to what somebody else is talking about or directing your attention to learn. So we're trying to look at social attention in pre-adolescent and adolescent kids. Now, the notion is, this early social attention and neuroplasticity has helped out. It's contributed to understanding how to do early intervention. We're assuming then if we can measure and understand school-related social attention, and there's neuroplasticity in adolescence, it should inform us on better interventions for older children as well. So this thing about neuroplasticity, neuroplasticity is a period of time when there's a very active sequence of organization, either cell development, connections between cells, and therefore the organization of neural functions, okay? And I just made that up, but I think that that'll hold for right now. We had a very good speaker in here a couple of weeks ago, and she made a very good point. There are these periods of really active neural development. One's in preschool, one's right before and into adolescence. During those periods, a lot of growth happens, a lot of change happens, but there are also periods of vulnerability for atypical development, for problems in development. So we really want to look at adolescence because we think it's probably a later vulnerable period for the emergence of the expression of some aspects of this thing that we call autism. And there's just as in the 80s we had a wealth of new data on early social development, we now have a wealth of new data on what's happening in adolescence and what's happening in the sort of relationships between brain development and cognitive development, and particularly brain development and social cognitive development or social development in adolescence. So there's every reason to suspect that if we look carefully at what's happening in pre to post-adolescence or pre-adolescence to adolescent groups, we might be able to get some clues as to maybe something that's making it a little bit harder for people with autism to have really positive adult outcomes. Now there's a really good group, a long-standing really good group at the University of Pittsburgh. And they've gotten to this idea pretty early on. They've started to say, yeah, well, maybe we should think about how can we measure different types of executive or cognitive functions from pre-adolescence to adolescence to adulthood and see if we see the emergence of some problems. And so one thing that they did was they looked at how well people with autism, children with autism versus controls, could use memory to guide very rapid attention shifts. And they found that there was no difference in 8 to 12-year-old children in that kind of measure. But then in adolescence, they started to be different. And then by adulthood, they were very different. And here, this is latency. So they're taking much longer. They're less efficient in using memory to guide attention. And again, you have the emergence of the problem in adolescence and then the complete expression of the problem in adults. It's a late developing onset of an issue for people with autism. Now here, same group, but now they're looking at memory for faces. Instead of recognition of faces, they're looking for recall of faces. And they find exactly the same thing. No problem in 9 to 12-year-olds. The beginning of a separation between the groups, indication the beginning that the typical sample here is starting to show a little bit better memory than the kids with autism. And then in adulthood, just like David was showing, you get this wide scatter, but you get more of the unfilled circles, which are the control group, and more of the filled circles, which are the people with autism. Group differences emerged by that point. So, what are we going to do? We're going to try to look at this, but instead of just looking at memory and attention, which aren't really related to social behavior, we're going to look at social attention. And here's the rub, though. It's hard to measure and to intervene with this in the preschool level, but at least it's kind of constrained to a one-to-one situation, right? When you get into the schools, or you get into school-age children, it's one-to-many. There's lots of distractors. Who are you going to pay attention to in the classroom? Who are you going to pay attention to in your peer group, whether when you're listening or talking? So in school-age kids, it's a little bit more complex. It's one-to-many. So it's too expensive to go into schools and try to do this, and it's too expensive to, you know, invite 20 kids to come in to help you run a procedure with one person as the person that's going to interact with the other 20 kids. So instead we're using virtual reality. Because in virtual reality now, I mean, it's a miracle. We can take a child, put this head-mounted display on them, and put them right in this classroom. And we can look at their attention, and moreover, their attention can control what happens in the classroom. They can actually interact with people in the classroom. And so NIH gave us some money to try to begin this, because this is very new, and we're you know, at the beginning of research, you really have to make some good guesses, and we were very fortunate to have people at Stanford and USC helping us make these good guesses. And what we did is we had 20 children with higher functioning autism, so they all have IQs above 70, actually above 80 in this study, and 20 age and IQ matched children who are controls, all of whom were nice enough to come to the Center for Mind and Brain, which is another affiliated unit of the M.I.N.D Institute on the Davis campus. And we divided the kids into younger kids and older kids. And we also looked at lower IQ and higher IQ, because that ends up being important. If you look at class placement, or what happens in special education, you find that an IQ of about 100 is a dividing point for kids with autism. They're getting very different services in school. And we also looked at ADHD, and I'm going to tell you about that quickly. But basically the task is this. The kids are wearing that head-mounted display. They can see about 9 different peers to their right, but they have to turn their heads to the left to see they can see about 5 to their right, and they have to turn their heads to see another 4. And we say, we want you to introduce yourself to these friends, these new people that are going to be in your class, and we're going to ask you questions about yourself, and while you answer, please look at everybody in the room. So this is a recording from a child who was, it's usually not quite so jerky. It's usually smooth motion. But this is basically a child looking around in the room. And you can see something that there are, different peers all the way around the room. And another thing is that some of these peers look like they're faded, and then they come back to life. And you can't quite appreciate it in this kind of jerky presentation. But in one condition, to make this easier for the kids, we say, remember to look at all the people in the room. And if you don't, they're going to start fading away. And then if you look at them, they're going to become solid again. So that gives the kids an external cue to remember to look. So basically we've got this no fade condition where nobody fades away, and then a fade condition. And then we measure the number of looks at peers, the number of different peers that they looked at, and then the average looking. Because some people think kids with autism have difficulty with social attention because they can't pull their attention away from somebody when they first look at them. So here's what we saw in this study. Here are basically the 8 to 11-year-old children. And we've got this group here are the control children, and this group here are the high-functioning children with autism. And at 8 to 11, there was no difference in the number of peers that they looked at while talking. There was also no difference in the number of words that they were using. There's no difference in the IQ. So at 8 to 11, there's no problem. They do it pretty much the same. There's no group difference. But by 12 to 16, there's a really big group difference. And these dotted lines represent the 95% likelihood that all the individuals in a group were within those bands. And so we see there's really great separation here. In fact, this is a very, very powerful effect. A big difference by adolescence. Very similar to the kind of difference that the Pittsburgh group was seeing with face recall. So Sally said that you can't judge one study. We only have one study so far, but the data look a lot like what's coming out of Pittsburgh, only with social attention. Another thing that's really interesting is that somewhere between 40 and 70% of higher functioning children with autism would meet criteria for ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. I have a lab in Miami, and we're beginning to suspect that there's a genetic contribution to that it's really not just autism mimicking ADHD, that there's two things happening for a subset, one of the subsets that David was talking about. But what we can see here is if we have just the two groups, control and high functioning autism, who were low on ADHD measures, there's actually not much of a difference in their attention at all in this, at all. They just looked fine. It's really one of the groups that really struggled here was the ADHD group, the high functioning children who were also affected by symptoms of ADHD. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. I want to show you something else though. Here's the no fade and the fade condition. Everybody goes up. That means this behavior, this social attention behavior, is malleable. We can probably intervene with this. We just did a quick and dirty intervention and everybody went up. So we know it's not a static thing. It looks like it's open to environmental intervention. I should also say that if we divided the kids, and we did, by lower IQ group and higher IQ group, we saw the same thing for the lower IQ group. Kids with lower IQ showed almost exactly the same profile relative to the controls as did the higher ADHD kids. And 12 out of 16 of the high-functioning children with autism were either affected by lower IQ or high ADHD symptoms. So we now have a really good sense that, some of the kids are doing just fine, but lower IQ or higher ADHD kids really struggle with this social attention task. The most important thing, though, that our hypothesis is that social attention is related to learning, and basically we found really fairly solid evidence of that. We used the Connors parent report of attention symptoms, but in that Connors parent report, there's a parent report measure of learning problems. And in both groups, we found very strong correlations between the learning problems, how many problems the parent were reporting, and how many of those avatars the kids looked at on average on trials. And again, we saw it in both groups, which is very important. It means that this is kind of a developmental phenomenon. It's not just specific to autism. It goes well beyond that. In the kids with autism, though, not looking at a lot of avatars was related to poor spelling, needs extra explanation, does not get the big picture, and poor math concepts. The areas that we think are pretty problematic, except for this poor spelling. I don't like that. I'm not a very good speller, so I didn't want to see that in there at all. But so basically, we think we have some sense that we need to go further now. We need to continue to study adolescent development, particularly in social attention. Because social attention is so complex, it's hard to do it in the real world, but we can do it pretty effectively in virtual reality. The social attention measure that we've used so far looks like it's open to intervention, and we think that virtual reality will be a good platform for intervention for children with autism as well. Thanks.
Dr. M.I.N.D. My child is 7, and I'd be interested in learning more about some of these post-kindergarten or preschool studies, because obviously it doesn't qualify for the studies that you're looking for, but still I'm looking for help because he is school age and having challenges. So tell us more about those.
Well, there is a number of people that are working with children in school, and depending upon the type of challenges, you could seek resources to address the challenges that your son has, and you could probably also get him involved in research.
Hi, I have a 6-year-old daughter with autism. I'm also in the speech language pathology program at Sac State. Wondering if you had volunteer opportunities for students to come in and learn a bit more since it's part of our curriculum there.
Absolutely. We have a really active volunteer program going on, and Terry, who do people call if they want to volunteer? Where do they start? So that you can call here and ask for Erin Roseborough, and she coordinates that. Everybody has to become registered as a volunteer through the university as a whole. But there are all kinds of opportunities for special events and for family support, so it's a really great experience. We also have a speech and language pathologist here, Amy Board, and you might have students who would like to shadow her or meet with her about what it's like to be a speech and language autism specialist.
One other point there, there's also the Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, which has training programs and is often trying to encourage people from Cal State to come over, because that's part of the mission, is to really integrate across the universities. And that's Robin Hansen, or you can actually just look up CEDD on the web page and look at options there as well.
Is there a database on the website where I can register my children when the M.I.N.D Institute is looking for more subjects for future studies?
There is a section called Get Involved in Clinical Research, I think is what it is now. And it will list all of the different studies that we have ongoing at the M.I.N.D Institute, and it'll say something about the age range. And, we do studies with autism, we do studies with other disorders, as Peter was mentioning, with ADHD and Tourette's and others disorders as well. I'm sorry? And typical development as well. So, yes, go to our website. If you have any problem, you could give us a call. But as Peter was saying, it's very, very extensive, and I don't know what the current number is because it keeps expanding so rapidly, but we have a very large number of studies ongoing.
And sometimes when you enroll, realize that you are in the database. There may not be a study right then that your child fits. So you might wait 6 months or even a year before you get an email saying there's a study available. If you're interested, let us know. So the fact that you may not get a response right away doesn't mean we didn't get it or that we're not interested. We're just always matching children who are in the database with different kinds of studies, and our studies have all kinds of parameters, like how many miles you live from the M.I.N.D Institute, and the age, and the birth date, and the sex, and all those things. So don't be discouraged if you don't hear right away. We're really happy that you enrolled, and you will be called.
Does diet and supplements make a difference in a child as they're growing up with autism, as they grow up into teenage years, adult years? How much information do you have on that, or do you have any?
Diet and supplements beyond autism is very individual. People respond to different supplements and different aspects of diet. That hasn't been looked at too clearly in children with autism yet. And so, and there's also very little longitudinal data about anything connecting to adulthood, let alone diet and supplements. There's a suggestion that some people are going to respond to different types of dietary changes, kids with autism. It's not clear that that autism is changing, but rather distress, discomfort are changing because the dietary constraint reduces GI disturbance. That's one possibility. But I don't think that there's a clear answer about how does supplements and diet affect development I don't think there's very much information at all on that, I'm afraid.
I think one thing that many of us are getting more concerned about, though, is the basic nutritional status of children with autism. That because of their unusual eating habits and in different diets that families may follow, kids may end up not getting enough of various nutrients. I don't know how many of you have had the experience of having a blood test with your physical exam, having your doctor tell you, oh, you're low in vitamin D or this or that. So children with autism are probably not as healthy eaters as most of the people in this room. And I think that's kind of where to start. Work with your doctor during that physical about what's the protein level your child is getting, how much calcium is your child getting, how many fruits and vegetables, and focus on basic nutrition before people get involved in the different diets. There isn't good, even for those studies that have been done on the gluten-free, casein-free diet, the studies that have used the best controls do not find a difference on the behaviors of children in those diets. But many families report that there are differences, and certainly we all have individual responses to what we eat. But don't neglect basic nutrition before you start getting involved in a diet. And make sure that, because as you all know, if you're hungry, your brain's not working right. You know, if you've got too much sugar and not enough protein, I don't know about you, I get pretty jittery. It affects your sleep. You know, it affects your alertness. It affects your temper. So I think we need to pay a lot more attention to the basic nutrition.
My question was about intervention. Do you have that information on intervention strategies that is on the website, or are you getting ready to publish some of these new things?
For the specific intervention we're using, you mean?
Correct.
We are, as I said, we are developing some internet-based ESDM materials now, and let's see. We aren't setting up a website, but we're going to have a manual out for parents in the next 6 to 12 months that will provide all the information that we share in the clinic with families, just like the book that we have out now is for therapists. So I don't think we have a goal of setting up an interactive website right now for the general public, but we will have the materials available.
But you do have the manual for the therapist as well.
The manual is published. I showed you a picture of it. Yeah,
that.
that's available through Guilford Press. I get royalties from that, so I'm not trying to make a hard
we
sell.
have that one. We didn't know. We have that one because we're
okay. And there's also there's a very good website called OCALI, Ohio something for low incidence, what is it? OCALI. And they have something on there called the Autism Internet Modules. These are really, really great access for anybody. It's a completely public website about ways of helping kids learn, ways about dealing with different behavior. It teaches you how to use all the basic techniques like reinforcement, discrete trial teaching, PRT. There's a lot of help there for those of you who are working with children with autism or living with them about how to refine your own approaches to them, including functional behavior assessment like you were talking about. So that there are public websites that have lots of information for teachers and families about how to work with kids on an individual basis. OCALI, O-C-A-L-I.
I noticed based on your research you had a link to ADHD. Do you know the percentage of the correlation between those two?
There are two fairly good studies in that they have sample sizes above 80, and in one it was 56% comorbid, and in the other it was 78%, very, very high. And then in another study of a twin sample of children with ADHD using a measure called the Social Responsiveness Scale, 48% of the twins with ADHD also met criteria for autism on the Social Responsiveness Scale. Those are the three most prominent studies. There's a couple more out there. There's one of the things with ADHD is that there are a variety of genes that may be involved. One of them is the DRD4 gene, and it has a particular element of it associated with ADHD. A study's just come out to indicate that what's called a polymorphism is related to oppositional and defiant disorder, or just upset behavior in young children with autism, which would go along with the ADHD related symptom presentation. But there's not much more than that, although the clinical sense of it has been there for a long time. People have often tried to tease apart what's attention disturbance in kids with autism and attention disturbance in kids with ADHD.
Do you have any plans to do studies with adult autistic people?
It's interesting because when the M.I.N.D Institute was first started, we were very interested in trying to understand the very earliest signs so we could get in and do whatever early intervention or preventative measures that would be possible. But I think the field in general has realized that we're ignoring this wave of individuals who are getting older and older. And in fact, the National Institute of Health has an organization called the Interagency Coordinating Committee, IACC, and they have just come out with a new set of priorities for research in autism, and one of the top priorities is actually to understand autism in adulthood, or in the transition to adulthood. So as Peter was saying before, we have almost no information on what happens to individuals with autism as they age. Are they more predisposed to certain illnesses or less predisposed? And that's because there just really hasn't been any research. So I think there probably, as the field goes, the M.I.N.D Institute will sort of, begin to initiate these studies, as well as the study that I mentioned, the Autism Phenome study, is really young kids. But our hope is that we're going to continue to follow those kids throughout adolescence and into adulthood, and really have an indication. There's actually some studies going on in the United States. The childhood, what's early childhood study or something. I can't remember exactly the name of it, but basically it's looking at 100,000 children just starting now throughout the United States, and starting, these are not with any disorders, but just looking at kids starting from when they're very, very young, and then the goal is to follow them through adulthood to see, what turns out, what's beneficial to them, what's not beneficial to them. We would like to do very much the same thing for autism. And I think with something like the Autism Phenome Project, there's another project that you might have heard here that Irva Hespechoda was leading called the CHARGE study, a very large cohort of subjects. So, we're just beginning to get into that. It sounds like I'm making excuses, and part of the issue with research is that you have to sort of pick your enemies. And initially our enemy was to try and understand the very earliest stages, and that's where we focused all our energy. But I think we now realize this is a very complex disorder. We can't ignore individuals who are older. We have to sort of deal with their concerns and their problems. So I'm certain that there will be a shift here and across the country.
I have a nephew in Cincinnati, and he was diagnosed with autism, and he started an ABA program at 20 months, and he's high functioning, he's verbal now, he improved a lot, but he's at 3.5 now in an early intervention preschool, and the main thing they're having problems getting help with, it seems like, or they want to know what's best for the social interaction. That still just seems to be the piece that's missing for him. I don't know if you have suggestions after that ABA treatment, where to go from there.
Phil Strain and Sam Odom's work on peer-mediated learning, there's a set of techniques for teaching other children how to be friends. This is on that Ocali website. If you go and look under social interventions, you'd find it. But there are some techniques, especially focused on other children, for how to help other children get the child with autism to respond and to initiate and to engage them in play. So that work, and then there's also the work on setting up those pretend play scenarios. Howard Goldstein, they weren't quite social stories, but it was symbolic play routines. So Goldstein, I actually wrote a review of this in the Journal for Autism and Developmental Disorders in about 2001. There's a review of social interventions for kids with autism, and these are all listed in there. So there are a number of little techniques, but they're in papers or on places like the Ocali website or in reviews, so that people have to find them. But there are a lot of different successful approaches for helping children with autism increase their responses to friends, increase their initiations of friends, and maintain their interactions back and forth longer.
The UC Davis M.I.N.D Institute began in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, learning disabilities, and other brain disorders is helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please call or visit our website to find out more about current studies, our research team, and upcoming events.